And we are live. So good morning, everyone. I'm Lee McDowell, and today we're going to look at content and language integrated learning. This is an online panel discussion, and this event is brought to you by, and it doesn't work because there it is. Nara JALT. JALT is the Japan Association of Language Teachers. So we're all in Japan, and all language teachers spread out across Japan. We are particularly, this chapter is the Nara chapter, and this event would typically be live, face-to-face in a room. Nara JALT hosts events around language teaching, about 5 a year, and bringing people together around various issues, contexts in language teaching. Today we're going to talk about, of course, content language integrated learning. And unfortunately, in the situation with the COVID-19 crisis that we're going through, we're not able to get together physically, but we have the next best thing here, an online recording. And so actually this is the first for Nara JALT in the history of Nara JALT. So it's a very auspicious occasion. And, but there could be a few hiccups. So apologies in advance. The focus of this online panel discussion, as I said, content language integrated learning. And in particular, we're going to focus on successful instances of CLIL and look at, what it looks like when it's working. And we'll also have a look at what it looks like when it's not working, because that can be quite informative too. But that's going to be the focus of this event. And I would like to now introduce, we have 3 panelists with me today. And if you could, guys, just give a little introduction for yourself, maybe just your teaching context specifically, a couple of minutes. I'll start with Brian Shaw. Could you introduce yourself, Brian?
Yes, thank you, Lee. This is Brian Shaw here. I'm in Osaka, so I hope you don't mind. I am very happy to join this group, and I thank you for the invitation. My teaching context, I teach mostly secondary school students, so that's junior, senior high school, throughout Japan. I teach and advise teachers as well as teaching students. And the content that I usually am teaching are subjects such as math and science. My background is in physics and engineering, and interestingly, art. So kind of an unusual combination.
Renaissance man.
Yes, well, yeah. So I am bringing different perspectives to a class. So when I teach mathematics, for example, I'm teaching the content of mathematics. And in Japan, of course, you have to be very careful of the language you're using and explain the language as you go along, as we will probably discuss in this panel discussion. But at the same time, I try to bring in issues about design, beauty, conceptual ideas. And I hope this is something we can talk about. The CLIL for me is not just about content and language. It's actually about training people how to think. I think that's a really key part of what the objectives of CLIL are. So I think I should leave it there. That's about 2 minutes.
Thank you, Brian. Wonderful.
Sure. Thank you.
Francesco, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Francesca Volstead, and I'm a New Zealand trained high school teacher. I currently run the Department of Clinical English at Nara Medical University. And in New Zealand, I train to teach, like Brian, a variety of subjects. So I teach economics, I teach biology and biotechnology, I teach Japanese language and social studies. Since coming to Japan, I've taught across a very broad range of age groups. I have worked with kindergarten kids from 3 onwards, and I think my oldest student was 92, working with culture classes. At Kyoto University, I teach part-time. I teach engineering students. I teach English for engineers, English for sciences, and I've done that for several years. So I, by chance, really have sort of fell into the CLIL field. It wasn't really by design, I have to be honest, but coming from a bit of an unusual background as a science teacher and working in Japan as a language teacher, there was a sort of dearth of teachers who were able to cover that broad spectrum, and I've really enjoyed filling that gap to some extent. So currently I run the Department of Clinical English at Nara Medical University, and in that capacity we are using epidemiology, we're using legal ethics for medicine, and actually first aid, first responder training. So that's enough from me, I think. Nice to meet everybody who's here to listen, and all of the panel members.
Thank you, Francesco. And with the current COVID-19 crisis, I imagine you'd be kind of a little bit more busy than normal.
Yes, my office in particular sits above one of the entrances to our hospital. So we are gearing up. We're the central hospital for infectious disease in Nara Prefecture. So yeah, it's a bit of a busy time.
All the best to you there. Thank you. Lawrence Anthony.
Hey, I'm Lawrence Anthony. I'm a professor at Waseda University in Tokyo, and I'm also the director for the Center for English Language Education in Science and Engineering, which we usually call CELES, as CELES. Our main teaching context is, of course, science and engineering students, and we have around 17 different departments going all the way from, things like civil engineering, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. So we cover all the STEM subjects there. But in terms of the CLIL context here, we're not really, this is part of the discussion coming up, I assume, but I wouldn't call myself a CLIL teacher. We would call ourselves ESP teachers, because we teach English for science and engineering, going from the first year undergraduate all the way through to PhD students. And so quite a broad range of students, going from people who really are just getting into the field to people who are going to basically are in the field, and certainly in the academic context. So that's what I'm doing. My own background is in science and engineering with a background in physics. So it's interesting that we have a kind of an overlap there in the panel. So I think the discussion we're going to go into from now would be, for example, am I doing CLIL? And if not, what am I doing? And I think that's going to be an interesting discussion to go forward with. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. Yes, ESP and the overlap, I think that's something that we're going to spend some time on, because I'm also from an ESP background. My name's Lee McDowell, and I work at the Nara Institute of Science and Technology here in Nara, where we do what I would call ESP approach, because our learners, our students are all actually graduates. They're all researching. They need English to get into their field, to get the information in and out. So yeah, I'm not an expert in CLIL by any means, but it's interesting. I think this is a very sort of promising area, and it's interesting to explore it with you today. And just to get us started, I want to look at, you can see there are 4 points here on this slide. This first one, what is or isn't CLIL? So, what is it that we're talking about when we talk about CLIL? And just to give us, or to get us on the page, I want to sort of give you just a brief overview of an approach that I've taken, not at the university where I teach, but outside of that in language just language, like what we would call conversation classes, that I kind of stumbled on over the years. I had, you know, getting started in language teaching, you pick up books, textbooks, and, you know, you start doing drills and all sorts of things. And it was, you know, quite a few years of trial and error there. And it wasn't until I found to actually focus on content that I started to feel much more comfortable in language as a language teacher. And so just to give you an idea of what I would do is, and you can tell me how much you think this is a CLIL approach, how much you think it is or isn't. What I would do is pick up a graded reader, and I sort of gravitated towards the non-fiction ones. For example, like, I'm not endorsing, but this is the Oxford Fact Files series, is something that I've used quite a bit with success. And so what I do is basically, you know, there's a topic right there, global issues, for example, and you've got units, you've got chapters that you can break into units, and just use that content as a way into language teaching. Now, I'm not an expert on global issues. That's not my background. Another example, for example, the Everest story is something I did recently. You know, I've never climbed Mount Everest, although Francesco, Hillary is one of your compatriots, right? From New Zealand. But it's just interesting to have that content there and to be able to explore the language at the same time as exploring a topic such as, you know, the Everest story or global issues. And so I would have students read a chapter before they come into the classroom. And then in the classroom, you know, we can do all sorts of activities like listening activities, of course, a lot of speaking activities because it's a focus on practical English. You can also do reading and writing activities, obviously. But just having that content is the platform into language learning. So what would you guys make of that as an approach to CLIL? Would you consider that as a CLIL approach? I'll start with Brian. Any comments?
Yes, sure. Thank you. I would point out, first of all, that within CLIL, there's typically two branches or two sort of instances of CLIL, soft or hard, or what is called weak or strong. And what they refer to is, for example, soft CLIL is when the objective is primarily to teach language and the content is kind of coming along for the ride, so to speak. So it makes it more interesting if you include content which is, you know, understandable for students, which is maybe relevant to current events or whatever. But your objective is actually, you know, language teaching primarily. So that's typically called soft CLIL or sometimes weak CLIL. Now, hard CLIL would be a case when the objective is to teach content primarily. And the language is a secondary thing that's, you know, it's a secondary goal. Now, in my own experience, I'm typically balancing both of those. I'm not primarily teaching language, although I'm trying to do that. In a sense, I'm trying to hit two birds with one stone. So I may have an objective, I'm teaching mathematics, but I'm teaching it mostly in English. And I should point that out, by the way. In my personal opinion, I don't think when you're teaching CLIL, you have to necessarily have it all English. I believe it's really helpful and necessary to include the native language of your students occasionally. If you can speak Japanese, you should be willing to use Japanese in cases where you need to overcome some sort of hurdle with a conceptual concept that you're trying to get across, and you're trying really hard to do that in English, and then you feel like it's not connecting. I think if you're able, you should quickly switch to Japanese as a way to kind of add oil to the machine to kind of smoothly keep it moving, because, you know, the objective is not to get bogged down. You know, the objective is to actually convey an understanding of some concept, right? And to sort of, as I said before, to stimulate students' thinking. If the students want to make a comment and they're unable to do it in English, again, I would encourage the teacher to allow them to do it in Japanese. And the teacher may or may not understand that explanation that comes back to them in Japanese, but that's not a problem either, because then you can ask other students in the class, well, can somebody rephrase that in English? You know, so this is we should keep in mind, it's a group lesson. This is not typically one-to-one. So you should try to utilize the aspect of the group, right? You know, the things that are available to you at the time. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. Strong, weak CLIL, is the primary objective content, or is it language? Is it a balance? These are very important things to keep in mind.
Great. So you would probably use the soft CLIL.
Well, typically, I do.
For that approach that I described, you would probably classify that definitely on the soft side, right?
Yeah, and I would say, having sort of moved around within CLIL circles in Japan, I'm a member of the Japan CLIL Association and so forth. I would say the great majority of teachers and participants in those types of organizations are soft CLIL practitioners.
Is that right?
By far. So that doesn't mean that there are no hard CLIL practitioners out there. I attended a meeting at Tohoku University a couple months ago in Sendai, and I was sitting at a table with a physics professor who was, you know, telling me that he was a Japanese professor. He spoke English very well. He was saying that, you know, it's very important that his students be able to discuss, you know, physics content in English, because they need to do, he was talking particularly about graduate students. They need to publish the research in English, because, you know, science now it's global. So you need to be able to deal with English. But that, I would consider that individual, you know, he's a sort of a hard CLIL type of individual. If his objective is to teach a physics class using English, you know, the main objective is the content of physics. You know, the English, you should do everything you can to support, you know, the language acquisition, but that's not the primary goal.
Thank you. So several points you've brought up there that I think we'll be revisiting, in particular that trade-off effect, a trade-off between content and language. I think that'll come up more as the discussion progresses. And then if we can move now to Lawrence. Lawrence, would you like to comment on that approach that I just briefly described?
I think the idea is for Francesco to go next.
Oh, sorry, Francesco.
Okay. So I'd go back to what Brian was saying about soft and hard CLIL, and say that I think that's really important. And to me, it's kind of a sliding scale. If you use those as concepts, and you have soft CLIL at one end of the scale and you have hard CLIL at the other, and most of the teaching contexts that I have seen or been part of are somewhere along that scale. Yeah. And as we move through the discussion today, we'll be looking at successful and unsuccessful instances of CLIL. And in my personal experience, mainly one of the key things that predicts the success or the lack of success is the understanding of the teachers about exactly what their goal is in terms of soft and hard CLIL. So often successful instances are where people really understand that this is a soft CLIL lesson, and that language is the goal, and we're using content in order to enable that language teaching. Or that this is a hard CLIL lesson, and that content is the goal, and that we're teaching language in order to support that content. And unsuccessful circumstances are where the teachers or the students get mixed up in that. So when we apply that to the kind of examples that you were giving, the readings that you are offering to students, I would put those into the soft CLIL side of things. And I would say that within soft CLIL, often the kind of teaching that you're doing might be referred to not as CLIL, but as content-based learning.
Content-based learning, yeah.
Or CBL or some other name often when it's in that area.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really important that people know as a teacher and as a student exactly what their goals are going into a lesson in order to have a successful lesson where they support students. That would be kind of one of the main points that I want to get out there.
Yeah, thank you, Francesco. Yeah, content-based learning, CBL, that was the term that was more familiar to me that when I was going through learning applied linguistics 10, 15 years ago. And then, you know, we were aware of CLIL as a separate sort of paradigm, particularly from Europe. I think the European was more popular there. But yeah, it was probably content-based learning that I was thinking when I went into that. But it's interesting now to look at it from a CLIL perspective. I skipped the order, but we'll finish up with Lawrence if you have anything to add. Lawrence.
Yes, sure. So just following on from the different ideas. I think the issue that we often have with what is CLIL and what isn't CLIL, and also what you were describing, is that CLIL or not? First, I would probably say it's not really important to put a label on things and just to be aware of what you're doing and have what is the purpose of what you're doing, as we just had touched on from the other panelists a few seconds ago. People seem to like labeling, though. And, you know, we have labels, and then people start using those labels to form organizations, and then they use those labels to write books about the topic and so on. But coming from a science background, I find it really important to actually, if you're going to start labeling something, to be clear what that label is describing. And what we tend to see in the field of applied linguistics, or just, in applied linguistics particularly, is that people like to coin terms without properly defining them, and then continue talking about them, and you could actually end up with cross wires, and people say, oh, what you're doing is not this, and oh, I'm doing this. So what I find interesting about CLIL and what it is and what it isn't, as Brian touched on, within the CLIL community, there's an idea of this hard and soft CLIL, or weak and strong CLIL. And as Brian nicely explained, the purpose of the weak CLIL is to focus on the language, with the content being a platform. And with the hard CLIL, strong CLIL, the purpose is the content. And I could reword that in a different way and say, so the purpose of soft CLIL would be, in an English context, it would be the English language for the purpose of understanding the course, or the content. And the hard CLIL would be, it's teaching content through English. And we have coined terms for those things. So English for specific purposes is the language for the specific purpose of understanding the content or the task, if you're in a workplace environment. But if you think of it as the content being the work that's involved. And in the hard context, we also have the word for that. So it's English mediated instruction. So teaching a particular course through the medium of English. So I would probably argue that we've kind of, and then there's the original meaning of CLIL, which is kind of this progressive idea in Europe that developed and right across the curriculum. I'm not that clear of the history of CLIL and where that term originated from, but it seemed to me to be a more overriding concept for a whole program. So as we've taken it, particularly in the Japanese context, it seems that we've coined the term CLIL to effectively describe ESP when it's soft, and EMI when it's hard. And now we say, oh, well, I'm doing CLIL, but I'm doing soft. Oh, I'm doing CLIL, but I'm doing hard. Well, you're effectively just saying you're doing EMI or ESP. So I would say, just to finish this, I think coming back to what the other panelists have talked about, it's all about the purpose of what you're doing. So if your purpose is to teach language, then you could call that soft CLIL, or you could call it ESP. And if the purpose is to teach content, you could call that hard CLIL, or it's EMI. English mediated instruction. So what you're doing, Lee, would be in my term ESP. It's just standard ESP. But some people might call that soft CLIL.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lawrence. I'm glad that you brought that up. I know you spend a lot of time on definitions. I've seen you presenting at various conferences, and is this ESP? Is this EAP? But that makes good sense, I think. And ESP certainly is a wider, more umbrella term, isn't it? Good. So I think we're much clearer now on what we're talking about when we're talking about CLIL and the varieties within the paradigm. And now,
can I just, sorry, Lee, can I just interrupt? You just said a moment ago that ESP is a more general umbrella term. I'd actually say it's not. And I think you could say that CLIL is the umbrella term that encapsulates ESP on the soft side and EMI on the hard side. I think that's where the actual confusion is. So if we want to use CLIL, I'm not sure if CLIL is a useful term to use because it does tend to confuse things. But if we are going to use it, I think it would be good to see it as an umbrella term for that right-hand side of the language and content cline.
It's not going to fit everything, isn't it? Because, for example, like English for research publication purposes is something that, that's a growing area now, sub-branch of ESP. And those people, practitioners, but also just people that are involved in using English for research publication purposes, they're not it's not integrated, it's not language integrated learning. They're actually just using the language for their research, essentially. So that comes under ESP, but doesn't necessarily come under CLIL. But I see the point. I see the point. So CLIL is a wider term. Is that fair? Is that what you want to say?
I would say yes. And I think we're also coming back to definitions again. What do you mean by content? Because I think in the framework that we're often using, we see content being like physics or chemistry or something like that. So if you're teaching a student to write a research paper, that's language, but the actual content is language, because writing papers is it's the point here. And it comes back to what science is all about. If you look at any kind of textbook in science, it's a lot of language. A lot of science, particularly, is about defining terms and explaining what they mean. So splitting content and language is not so easy to do in those cases. But yes, generally, CLIL, I would say, is the wider term, and content within that could be any task or any work, and that sometimes involves language. But yeah, it's the purpose of the course.
Can I add to what Lawrence is saying there? For me, I actually first sort of became interested in CLIL as a student and then a teacher of sciences, exactly for the reasons that you're saying. That when I was a student studying biology or studying chemistry, one of my most common study methods with the exam coming up and not having been properly prepared would be to go to the back of the book and look at all of the definitions for all the words. And with science, I really found that if you understand what a word means, I don't just mean in a general context in the way that we usually understand what a word means in English. If you understand what it means and how to apply it and how to apply that concept that it represents, then you're understanding the science behind it. And so I spent a lot of my career as a science student and as a science teacher teaching English, in fact, or learning English.
That's right.
And that was exactly as Lawrence was saying. When we define ESP and CLIL, I'm not working from textbook definitions, but from my feeling as a teacher, I would slightly differentiate between ESP and CLIL in that if I was teaching, for example, in my context, a medical doctor, a graduated doctor who understands the medical field very well, and I'm aiming to enable them to use their current understanding of medicine in English, so they understand it in Japanese and we're moving to English, that would be very much an ESP field for me. You could call it soft CLIL, but I would tend to think of that as ESP. What I do with undergraduate students a lot of the time, I would call CLIL, and the difference being that we are introducing to them epidemiological topics, medical research and statistics, or clinical medicine, first aid, and they don't yet know the content. So to some extent, while I'm teaching the language, I'm also having to teach the concept for the very first time. And whether that's hard or soft depends a lot on how much I have to teach the concept, the content, the concept, and how important it is for them to know that now. If it's very soft, then we're introducing it, we're using it for debate. If it's very hard, then I'm teaching them first aid, and straight after my course, they might have to actually use it with a patient on the street. So that's just a little difference for me between ESP and CLIL, is whether the student already knows or has some understanding in their own language of the content, or whether I am trying to teach the content.
Just to come back up to that, that's why we also have EMI, which is English mediated instruction. So again, coming back to the goal of the course, if the goal of the course is to teach the content, it's clearly not ESP. If the goal is to teach the content that's through English, then that would be what English mediated instruction is. So clearly they're different. So I would agree with that. So CLIL being that, but we need to always distinguish between soft and hard CLIL, because of this, the CLIL term covers both. So I think it's useful to see, and it's a client as well, of course. So there's going to be cases where they don't know the language a lot. So you need to focus more on the language in that course. But it's still, the goal is the class is to understand the content. So it's still EMI with just a lot of work with the E part of the EMI.
Yeah. So they know the concepts. They don't know the language necessarily, or maybe they know the language but don't know the concepts. Those are important issues.
Right.
No, I would say that.
May I just add? I think, Lawrence, the points you make are very good, and I agree. Also, Francesco, you talked about the spectrum between hard and soft. I absolutely agree. And this point about the content versus language, if they're familiar with the content already, it may look like, if you're observing that lesson, it may look like it's a hard CLIL lesson. But if the teacher that's teaching is just reviewing content that's already known, that's really more of, the heavy lifting is on the language acquisition side. It's not the concepts per se, because if they're already familiar with them, you're just reviewing something they know in English. So the traction you're getting, so to speak, is on the language side. What's really hard, and I think what's the ultimate goal, is to somehow simultaneously teach new content, new things that the students are unfamiliar with, or that expands upon existing knowledge and understanding, while at the same time expanding upon the language abilities, right? So their English abilities, if you're teaching in English. So if you could do that simultaneously, that's kind of the magic, right? I mean, that's kind of the ultimate goal. It's very difficult to do that, by the way. Yeah. And getting back to this issue of terminology, one of my concerns is, because it's so vague and it's, there's all these other competing sort of crossing, terms like EMI, English immersion, there's so many other different terms. My concern is if somebody says, I do CLIL, and if they don't do it well, and people get this image, if they see that lesson and it basically is not effective, people think, oh, CLIL, that doesn't work. That's a bunch of baloney. Forget that. So,
Yeah.
you know, I actually had a conversation with a president of a university in the US who just came to Tokyo a couple months ago. And she was formerly in Rome. She was head of Temple University in Rome. And she asked me what I do. And I said, you know, I do CLIL in Japan. And she says, oh, CLIL. Oh, yeah. You know, and immediately I realized she didn't have a very good positive image about CLIL. She says, yeah, in Italy, you know, they force teachers to do that. They're not qualified. You know, their English ability is just not there. And it's just a mess. That was her comment. So this is my concern. So, you know, what we call it really isn't that important.
Yeah.
What is important is what you're actually doing, and is it effective relative to your goal?
Yeah.
Right. So first of all, what is your goal with content, language, or a mix? And is what you're doing getting students to that goal? And that's ultimately what matters, right?
I think that's really true what Brian is saying there, and I think it's interesting that we have amongst the panel here, we have an agreement that to some extent, you know, these definitions are a bit vague, and it's not what you label things, but all of us are really interested in defining these terms for ourselves. We're not trying to push that on others, but we've obviously been thinking about it a lot and trying to get an understanding for ourselves. And I think that that's actually really important, because I notice that I might go into a class with the objective of doing what I would call a soft CLIL lesson. So I'm teaching some interns, and I'm thinking we're going to talk about something they know how to do, like diagnosis. And I'm going to be using this content just as a scaffold for my language. So I'm planning a lesson that's based around English. We're going to do diagnosis. We're going to do taking a patient history, and they're going to know how to do all of those things. And a few minutes into the lesson, I realize, uh-oh, these students don't know that content well enough. And suddenly, because I have some understanding of the definition for myself, I'm aware of the fact that I'm now going to change my goals for the lesson. It's more important to me now that my medical students know how to do a patient history and how to do a diagnosis than it is that they know English. And so I'm changing my goals. I'm shifting my goals. I'm going to keep going with the lesson. The students might never notice, but because I have an understanding of soft and hard CLIL, I feel that I do a more effective lesson at the end of the day.
Right.
Very interesting. Thank you. Well, I think now with that clearer picture, we can move on and look at some successful instances of CLIL, because this is another way to help develop our understanding of this approach. And so I'm going to ask Brian if you can give us a brief overview of you know, perhaps your own application, I'm not sure, of CLIL, something that you've been successful with in the past.
Okay, sure. I would like to also point out two different ways of sort of teaching CLIL. I think if a teacher of a regular class, let's say, I'll use the example of mathematics because that's a topic I frequently teach. If your job is to teach, say, a first-year high school mathematics course, which meets 3 times a week, and you're going to teach that course in English, and you're going to follow the curriculum that is set by the Japanese Ministry of Education, then you don't have to really decide so much what to teach, but it's an issue of how you teach it. That's what I would call sort of a regular lesson, weekly lesson, sort of an instance of CLIL. Those actually don't exist that much. There are some schools doing that, but very few in Japan right now. But it's becoming more popular. Now, what I usually do, I have done that, but most of my work is what I call special events. So in a special event, you go into a school. As a teacher, you're not really familiar with the students. In some cases, you have no idea. You've never met them before, all right? So this presents some special challenges that you wouldn't ordinarily have if you're teaching the same students, 3 times a week.
Yeah.
So in a special event, you don't know the students typically. The numbers of students tend to be very large. So in a standard classroom, you're typically going to have up to 30 students. I've taught events, special events of over 200 students. And again, that presents other challenges. You don't have the opportunity to do interaction with students as much. And the danger of that is it becomes more of a lecture. And I don't think CLIL as a lecture works. This is my personal opinion. And I'll tell you why. I think this gets to what Francesca just mentioned a few minutes ago. You may go into a lesson with a goal of teaching some content, assuming that those students have a base knowledge. And you may find out that they don't have that base knowledge. And you have to sort of shift gears. You have to change, back up. And I think that's very important, by the way, because if you just plow ahead and you ignore the facts on the ground, you're doing that at your own risk, because you're going to disconnect from students. And, Japanese students are usually very polite. They'll smile and they'll nod, but they will have no idea what's going on. So to be successful in CLIL, I think you have to establish that interaction with students. And the reason is as a teacher, you have to confirm that, they're following along. They're following along in terms of the concepts that you're teaching and the language, right? And again, you can do that. You can jump into Japanese occasionally just to confirm their understanding, but you want to stick to English mostly. So anyway, I want to point out those two differences. It's kind of like this typical, you're meeting the same students, you got a set curriculum, and you go forward, versus sort of a special event where you don't know the students, the numbers are very large. And also in some of those cases, you have a lot of sort of observers in the room. You have teachers, administrators, you have teachers from other schools who come to observe this, to understand, well, what is CLIL? How does it work? And what I find is you have to be real clear on, as a teacher, what your objective is. Are you trying to sort of satisfy students? Are you trying to satisfy the teachers in the back of the room who may be, math teachers, or they might be English teachers, right? So they have a very different kind of set of sort of expectations and what they think qualifies as an effective lesson. I've learned that from experience, because I've sent out, student reflection sheets. I can see what the students think. I get those feedback from teachers. Sometimes the teachers say, well, that content, that was too easy. They're a math teacher. They go, oh, that was too easy. But the students' comments was, it was just right. That was right on. In terms of the content, the level was good. The language is good. On my feedback form that I usually use, I list out what percentage did you understand in terms of content? What percentage did you understand of the language? And sometimes I'll get a high reading on content and a low reading on language, or the reverse. So my goal as a teacher, what I think, we talk about successful instances, what I would call a successful instance is when you get feedback from students, whether it's in writing or it's verbal, and basically they walk away with the feeling like, I understood 80% of that content, and I understood about 80% of the language. All right. Now, I'm not looking for 100, right? Because if I'm scoring at 100, that tells me as a teacher, I didn't push it more than, I didn't push it enough. I should push them outside the comfort zone. There should be some things that I say that maybe they don't understand, but they have an interest to try to figure that out after the class, right? They're going on their own research, right? Because again, CLIL is content language integrated learning. It's not teaching. So I want the goal here is for the students to learn. That could happen in the class, that could happen after the class, and hopefully they're going to be stimulated to go and do research on that topic later, right? And as a teacher, you want to try to encourage students to do that. You want to teach them how to do that, to ask questions for themselves, to go and search for answers to those questions, right? So I think it's not just limited to what happens in the class, but thinking more broadly, you know, you're trying to teach students how to learn. And I think that's another sort of special thing about CLIL, as far as the way I understand it, that it's focused on learning, not necessarily teaching per se. Better stop and leave it there.
Thank you, Brian. It just brings to mind that there's a term that's bouncing around Japanese context a lot at the moment, active learning. And, you know, that seems to be a catchphrase at the moment in the universities, but that just seems like good learning to me. Like, you know, that's more like traditional learning to me, but certainly, yeah, it needs to be active. Thank you, Brian. I'll move on to Francesco. If you want to come in and give us an idea of some successful instance of CLIL that you've had experience with.
Okay, so I would like to talk about Nara Medical University and the program that we're running at the moment, which although we're constantly developing it, and although we see problems in it all the time, I think is overall quite a successful program. So I would divide our program into two parts, and this is a good example of soft and hard CLIL, or weak and strong, however you'd like to divide this up. So for first and second year students, we run English classes, which are compulsory. Students need to participate in those classes, and if they don't pass the class, they can't move on to the next year of medicine. So these are, you know, quite high stakes classes for the students, and medical students would really much prefer to graduate in 6 years rather than 7 or 8. And those core classes are good examples of soft CLIL. So definitely those are language classes, and we're aiming to get students a understanding of English language and an ability to use the skills of debate and discussion. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, I'm curious, Francesco, how many hours would they spend in the first year on those compulsory subjects?
So each student will take 2 classes a week of English language. So it's the same subject, but 2 classes, and each class is 90 minutes long.
Right.
We divide classes up into about 20 students. So we have quite a broad team of teachers. We have medical doctors, we have lawyers, we have biologists, we have health specialists, we have English language teachers, and so we have a team approach. We have classroom time, I think, is very limited when you're talking about 3 hours a week, but we also have an opportunity for students to interact with teachers in English. Lunch times, they're free to come into my seminar room. So that's not part of the class, but it's an ability to, a support to speak English. So I should acknowledge that some universities may not have that. So it's only 3 hours and homework. Students focus, the topics start off with lifestyle topics coming into medical lifestyle topics, and move on to medical research and how that's done. And we use those as those epidemiological topics as a base for discussion and debate. And it's the discussion and debate that is the goal of the classes. So sometimes students will have what I would call misunderstandings of the epidemiology. That will not affect their grade in those core subjects. Then we have advanced classes. So advanced classes are on specific topics within medicine. It could be medical ethics and the law, where we have an ex-lawyer to teach that from New Zealand. It could be looking at taking patient histories, medical communication, clinical communication, taking patient histories and giving patient histories, where we have a medical doctor to teach that. Or it could be first aid, first responder training, which I train. I take students over to New Zealand to train with EMS staff. So those are hard CLIL. Actually, the language is not the goal. We are looking to teach a specific skill, medical skill, and we know that we need to teach some language in order for students to master that, because we're using English as our medium. So those are two successful instances, I think, and one is soft and one is hard. And what I've found over the last 5 years is that the secret to that success is getting both students and my team of teachers to understand which it is they're doing. And when it's been unsuccessful, it's tended to be, for example, in one of our core classes, a medical doctor focusing on the content. Oh, the students have misunderstood the content. This is not okay. We shouldn't be giving them a good mark, and we have to rail that in. Right. Or a language teacher focusing on the language when they're meant to be teaching, say, in my case, first aid. And if I focus too much on what they said to the person, it doesn't matter. If the person is unconscious and you communicate with them using sign language and you get the information, it's a content class. And so that's okay.
Interesting. Thank you, Francesco. Lawrence, would you like to take us through some kind of successful instance of CLIL in your experience? Okay.
Actually, there's quite a similar parallel to what Francesco just described. So I'd like to describe the program that we run at Western University, Science and Engineering. And as he said, we have various problems and things, and we're still always trying to improve the program. But we did have an external review of our program a few years back, and we had some academics and workplace people come in and look at it, and one of them described it as the best English program in Japan. So hopefully that's a reason to describe its success. So we've got this program. Yeah, we've got this program going through from the first year undergraduate to PhD students, and basically encapsulating 10,000 students in this program. And if we're going to use the framework from CLIL, as Francesco did, I would say almost exactly like him, we start off with soft CLIL, which we would call as General English ESP. So the focus of the courses is on language, and it's basic language skills to be able to be successful academics. So learning how to take notes, listening to lectures, take notes, learning how to communicate, ask questions, do discussions, and so on. So it's purely a language focus, and that's that. So that's the first 2 years, and interestingly, it's all the same. The time frame is also the same. So 2 classes a week of 90 minutes for all students. They're all required courses, and they can't graduate unless they get past those courses. So once we get into the 3rd and 4th year in graduate school, then we have elective courses, and this is where the slight difference comes in from what Francesco was describing. So we have advanced English courses, which we would call as English for specific academic purposes, maybe. So we're looking at how to give a presentation, how to write a research paper that could be published, and so on. And when you get to PhD students, of course, they're actually trying to publish right there and then. So it's still within the academic context, but it's definitely moving towards in some sense, the content, right? Because the students need to be able to successfully navigate this. So the requirements, when you think about the requirements of the teachers, to be able to instruct a student on how to submit a successful paper, they do need to understand some of the content in those papers, because they can't instruct the students otherwise. So there is definitely a shift there slightly towards EMI, if we're going to go in the ESP EMI kind of climb. And you could use the CLIL terminology and say that's moving towards hard CLIL. But what I would say is the difference is that we don't, within CELS itself, within our program, we don't start teaching maths and physics, because we have content teachers to teach that. So the university is trying to move students into an English-mediated instruction environment so they can take courses in English at any point. And certainly at graduate school, they'll be taking courses in English. So it's not our role to teach physics and maths or any of these STEM subjects, because we hire real experts in those areas to be able to teach those classes. So I think that's a very important thing to kind of have in the mind of the teacher when they're in those classes. If we're teaching a graduate school class in physics, we need to have graduate school level physics understanding as a teacher to be able to teach the content of that. And coming back to, I think, what Brian was saying earlier, or maybe it was Francesco, if we're in a graduate school physics class and we're teaching basics of, like the structure of the atom, they know that content already. So then it's purely language. So what are you doing in the class? It becomes confusing. So I would say the successful nature of our program is because it is scaffolded to, starting out with this more general English for specific purposes, moving into more English for general academic purposes, moving into English for specific academic purposes, relying on teachers who have increasing knowledge of the content to be able to navigate those classes. So there's less requirement to understand the content when you're just teaching how to take notes, listening to a lecture and take notes. But you need more of it when you're teaching them how to give a presentation in physics, for example. And then we also move towards an EMI environment by by basically relying on content course experts as they move through the program. I noticed a few other people were talking about unsuccessful instances. Shall I wait for the next section to talk about the unsuccessful?
That is
examples?
the next section. Yeah, well, if you want to continue,
okay,
please go ahead.
Okay, so I noticed that the other two panelists were mentioning some unsuccessful examples of it. And I would say, for example, if you think of the CLIL in the soft and the hard framework, in the soft framework, in the soft CLIL, which is ESP, we're focusing on language, and language is an interactive tool. So clearly, you're going to have an interactive environment to teach soft CLIL. If you're in the extreme right side of that client and you're in an EMI environment, of course you don't need to have an interactive environment because there's numerous courses across the world in content courses that are lecture based. So again, I think this is where the confusion can come with CLIL, is to understand what part of the client you're on. And I guess Brian was talking about that middle area where they know some of the content and they know some of the language, but you never know where they are in that client. So you need to be in an environment where they can move from an interactive environment or to more of a lecture-based environment. So if you set it up from the start to be purely content teaching, then you're going to have trouble when you realize they don't know that. And just coming on to the active learning aspect, I think traditionally, particularly in Japan, there's been a strong focus on content in the sense of just knowledge transmission. So they tend to be lecture-based and large classes. But if you do start moving towards the language focus, which is an interactive skill, then you of course need to have smaller student classes and you need more active learning in that sense. So I think that's where the concept's coming. Maybe the content class teachers have realized also that to be able to really know the content, you need to kind of demonstrate that through some kind of active learning approach. So the unsuccessful, I was going to give you one example of where CLIL could go wrong. Just finish with a quick example here. So if we start thinking that an English teacher, I'm going to use the term English teacher now, is in a CLIL environment and needs to know the content, then they can go two ways. One way is they start teaching very general content, which the students probably already know. Like you showed that global issues example. They probably already know those topics and the concepts that are in there. So it's really just a platform for the language. So it's still ESP, or it could be even like content, what is the term? Content mediated instruction, CBL, content-based language teaching. But the other way is they start thinking, oh, okay, I really need to know this content. And I know some examples of teachers in Asia, I won't say which country because they'll be able to identify who I'm talking about, but who have trained up, the English teachers have been required to take master's courses in content subjects so that they can teach the English class. So the English class becomes a content class, and then you have that danger of requiring teachers to become experts in a field which they traditionally weren't trained for. Or worse, and I've seen this happen as well, you don't train them and they get stuck into a class and they're supposed to know physics and they don't, and they start making rudimentary errors in the understanding.
Right.
Okay, I'll finish there.
And I would just like to follow on just on that comment. I have seen that, and it's cringeworthy. I mean, there's people that are teaching. Just a couple of months ago, I observed a class in Tokyo. The teacher was teaching junior high physics. It was an optics class. And it wasn't just the problem with the terminology. You know, in optics, you have to talk about medium, right? Waves, light is a wave or it's a particle. Yeah. And then light travels through mediums. And then if it travels through, a more dense medium, it slows down, right? And then he started to try to explain density as thickness. And thickness is, a description of physical dimension. It's not density. Density is the amount of stuff per unit volume, right? It's a completely different concept, fundamentally different concept. But his way to, in a way, he was trying to convey the concept to the students. And so I can understand, he's doing the best he could. He didn't have ill intent, but he was actually not explaining it in a way that was correct. It was completely wrong. And so, so that's the danger. And that's the sort of situation that concerns me when I see it, because this is somebody who signed up for that. Maybe he presented himself as being able to teach the topics, right, in English. And clearly he wasn't qualified. I mean, he didn't have the basic understanding to be able to teach those topics. So, yeah. Let's leave it.
Yeah, good.
Can I add
with Francesco? If you don't need to name any names, but if you have some experience with unsuccessful instances of CLIL and you'd like to share.
So I would like to start off by just expanding on one where I was responsible, and then move into somewhere where I was acting under someone else's orders. So when I first started teaching first aid and first responding to our medical students, my background in that had been through being an avid hiker in New Zealand, and New Zealand high school students get trained up in outdoor education, and we do first aid. So I came in, with that kind of very, very much a beginner's knowledge, and I was working with the students, and I was aware. I have a background in team teaching, so I was aware that maybe this was a good chance for me to bring in an expert to work with who didn't have the language teaching skills but had the content skills. So I started taking students to New Zealand and working with some of the best EMS staff in the world, from all across the world, working in New Zealand. And I would often be getting told off by them because I would be focusing on the language too much. And they would be saying, you're slowing down our class. The communication the students is doing is absolutely fine. New Zealand students are only able to do that level of communication in a stressful situation too. Don't worry about it. Just let them get on with what they're doing, doing a physical check. So I was unsuccessful in that circumstance, and I've learned from that, and I've trained myself up. As Lawrence was saying, I'm in a position where I have to keep training to keep providing those skills. I've also been involved in teaching at primary schools a lot, up until 10 years ago. And there are a lot of content-based programs that I've been involved with in primary schools where the goal, in my opinion, should have been soft CLIL. Primary school, we should be teaching language. And it's not uncommon for the teachers to get confused and start focusing on the content. So we'll be doing some kind of an art and craft, maybe origami class. Now, to me, the goal is for them to learn words like fold and right and left and corner. And we're using the origami as a platform for that. But often what happens is that the teacher stands up the front and they get the origami. The students get lovely, beautiful origami because the teacher shows them with their hands as they fold it, but the teacher doesn't get the language across. So to make that class successful, I would always be telling the teachers, don't hold the paper. Usually when I'm teaching origami, if the goal is to get the origami done, of course I will show them the paper. But if my goal is language, I will take the paper away and I'll stand up the front and I'll say, take the top right-hand corner, fold it down to the bottom left-hand corner, and the students will all be confused and their origami will be terrible, but they'll actually learn the language.
Yeah.
I've been involved in a lot of primary school classes where the students came out with lovely origami to take home and give to their parents, and to be honest, very little understanding of English.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's really helpful for all of us, you know, looking at not so successful applications and that balancing act between content and language. Very, very interesting. I think we can wrap it up with that now, and I'll just say thank you to everyone. Brian, thank you very much. Lawrence,
Oh, thank you very much
Francesca, for joining us this morning. And also, I'll say a quick thanks to the officers at Nara JALT that do a lot of work behind the scenes to keep the chapter moving. And we have had some support from Osaka JALT as well. They were going to pitch in financially to help make the event, but actually, you know, in the end, it's all online, so the costs are minimal. But still, thanks for Osaka JALT for being there. I'd like to finish off announcing that, you know, our next event is going to be in June, but actually there's quite a good chance that it won't be in June. In fact, it won't be happening in June, but it may happen online. So, you know, in order to keep relevant, to keep active in this time, Nara JALT, you can look out for more content like this coming onto the YouTube channel. So look out for that. But that was originally initially that was planned to be a collaboration between the Teachers Helping Teachers SIG and the Extensive Reading SIG. They're working together to put extensive reading programs into other countries, and also teaching young learners, because those programs were primarily aimed at young learners. So that's just something to look out for. In terms of special interest groups, we could finish, Francesco, I know, has been making some efforts to start up a special interest group within JALT. JALT doesn't have a special interest group for CLIL, but that's something that you're working on, Francesco?
Yes, so I'm actively pursuing that, and I would like to have a CLIL SIG available, special interest group available at JALT. And I acknowledge that we do have other SIGs that cover some of the soft side of CLIL and some SIGs that cover some of the hard side of CLIL, as Lawrence would probably point out very correctly here. I think that CLIL offers a good chance for university teachers and primary school teachers and everyone in the middle, junior high school language teachers, to come together and work. And it offers a good chance for Japanese nationals and foreign nationals to come together and share their experience because of the broadness of its definition. And so I hope that we can get that SIG up and going, and that will be something that all of the panel members and you, Lee, and the people who are tuning in to watch this will be able to be part of.
Great. So look out for that. Maybe at Nara JALT we can help promote those efforts when they start to, you know, for example, membership and so on.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, let's finish it up there. Thank you once again for your time this morning and your expertise and experiences. It was very informative. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that people listening also got a lot out of it. And it's too bad we couldn't be in person, but maybe sometime when all this clears, we'll be able to get together. And but in the meantime, thank you very much, and be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lawrence. Thanks, Brian.
And now I'm going to stop the recording.
Yep, that looks like you stopped it. Oh, you've stopped my video.
We've got a lovely picture of you there,
You
Lawrence.
cannot start the video.